Welcome to today's lecture, where we'll explore the concept of ethnicity, a key factor in understanding how individuals and groups relate to one another socially and culturally. Let's start with a comprehensive definition of ethnicity and break down its components. Ethnicity refers to the shared values, attitudes, and behaviors that shape the identity and interactions of individuals within a group. These elements include cultural, language, customs, traditions, and organizational, such as tribal or national affiliations, and ideational, religious beliefs, components. According to Dreger 2003, ethnicity plays a crucial role in defining how people understand their social connections, both psychologically and in their broader cultural and organizational contexts. In other words, ethnicity isn't just about where someone comes from, but how they behave, what they believe, and how they interact within society. For example, a shared religion like Christianity or Islam, or common customs such as specific wedding traditions, may bind members of an ethnic group together. These shared cultural and organizational values contribute to an ethnic group's sense of identity and cohesion. Ethnicity helps create social distinctions between groups of people, primarily based on cultural traits like language, religion, customs, and historical experiences. For example, language can be a powerful marker of ethnic identity. Whether it's French, Cree, or Punjabi, language binds people together and often reflects broader cultural ties. Similarly, customs, like holiday celebrations or traditional clothing, reinforce group identity and serve to distinguish one group from another in society. But ethnicity is not just about differences. It's also about how these groups interact with each other. For example, two groups with different languages or customs might live side by side, forming distinct yet interconnected communities. These social relations influence how groups view themselves and others, which can be positive, neutral, or in some cases negative, depending on historical and social contexts. Now, it's essential to address race and its relationship to ethnicity. While ethnicity is tied to cultural identity, race is a socially constructed concept. Unlike ethnicity, which is rooted in shared cultural and social characteristics, race is based on perceived physical differences, such as skin color, that have been given social meaning over time. It's important to emphasize that race has no biological foundation. The idea that different races of people are biologically distinct has been debunked by science. However, race remains a powerful social category used to categorize and often divide people. Understanding that race is a social construct created and perpetuated by society helps us recognize how racial categories have been used to justify inequalities and shape social hierarchies. These racial categories often overlap with ethnic identities, complicating the way people experience their identity in different social and cultural contexts. Now, let's examine the concept of visible minority populations, a term that has generated significant debate and criticism. This term has been criticized for being artificial, unnecessary, and counterproductive. The term visible minority is often used in Canadian contexts to refer to non-white populations, but it has been widely criticized as being an artificial and unnecessary categorization. Critics argue that labeling certain groups as visible minorities reinforces divisions based on race and skin color, which can be counterproductive to efforts aimed at promoting equality and inclusion. The term creates an us versus them dynamic, emphasizing difference rather than commonality. In Canada, the Federal Employment Equity Act officially defines visible minorities as persons other than Aboriginal peoples who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. This legal definition was created to ensure fairness in employment practices by identifying and addressing potential discrimination in the workforce. However, the definition itself has drawn criticism for its oversimplification, as it lumps together a wide range of ethnic and racial groups under a single label without considering the vast differences in their experiences. For instance, people of South Asian, East Asian, African, Caribbean, and Middle Eastern descent may all be considered visible minorities under this definition, but their cultural backgrounds, histories, and experiences of discrimination can differ dramatically. The term fails to capture these nuances. One of the strongest critiques of the term visible minority comes from the argument that it reinforces whiteness as the default or standard. According to critics like Woolley, 2013, there is something inherently problematic, some say almost racist, about the assumption that whites are the baseline and anyone else is noticeably, visibly different. This way of thinking implies that whiteness is normal and everything else is other, which perpetuates the idea that non-white populations are outsiders or deviations from the norm. In this sense, the term visible minority can serve to reinforce racial hierarchies rather than dismantle them. It positions whiteness as the invisible, unmarked category, while making non-white populations hypervisible in ways that often lead to stereotyping, discrimination, and exclusion. Next, we'll explore the historical immigration patterns in Canada and how they have been shaped by various economic, social, and political factors. Canada has a long history of immigration, with record numbers of immigrants arriving in the early 1900s. This period saw a large influx of people from various parts of Europe, particularly from countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Ukraine, and Italy. Immigrants came seeking better opportunities, attracted by Canada's growing economy and the promise of land and employment, especially in agriculture and industrial sectors. At that time, immigration was seen as a way to populate Canada's vast territories, especially in western provinces, and to build the labor force for economic growth. The country needed people to work in industries like farming, mining, and railroads, making immigration a key part of Canada's nation-building strategy. However, the number of immigrants to Canada didn't always increase steadily. Immigration numbers fluctuated depending on external factors like economic conditions and government policies. During periods of economic boom, such as the early 1900s or post-World War II, Canada saw more immigrants coming in because job opportunities were plentiful, and the country actively encouraged immigration. In contrast, during economic busts, such as the Great Depression of the 1930s, immigration rates dropped dramatically as jobs became scarce and governments tightened immigration policies to protect local workers. Political changes and global events such as wars or shifts in government attitudes towards certain ethnic groups also affected who was allowed to immigrate. Additionally, the development of communication and transportation networks made it easier for people to migrate. As technologies like the telegraph, steamships, and later airplanes became more advanced, it became more feasible for people to move across great distances. This global connectivity allowed people to access information about Canada more easily and to travel more efficiently, leading to waves of immigration when conditions were favorable. To attract immigrants, the Canadian government and private companies employed recruitment strategies like posters and pamphlets, which were distributed throughout Europe and other regions. These materials promoted Canada as a land of opportunity, showcasing its vast, fertile land and its need for hardworking settlers. Many of these recruitment efforts focused on rural farming opportunities, where immigrants were promised affordable or even free land in exchange for developing it. These posters and pamphlets often painted an idealized image of life in Canada, emphasizing economic prosperity and a welcoming environment, while glossing over the harsher realities immigrants would face, such as difficult working conditions, harsh climates, and cultural isolation. Next, let's look more closely at how the origins of immigrants changed over time and the impact of global events on immigration flows. At the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of immigrants coming to Canada were from the United States or the United Kingdom. These regions had close cultural and political ties to Canada, which made migration more accessible and attractive. The familiarity of language, similar legal systems, and perceived opportunities in Canada encouraged people from these areas to settle here. The vast open land in Western Canada was particularly appealing to farmers from the US and the UK looking to start new lives on fertile land. By the 1920s, immigration patterns started to shift, and a significant number of immigrants were arriving from Eastern Europe, particularly from countries like Ukraine. These immigrants were attracted to the opportunities available in Canada's agricultural regions, especially in the prairies, where they could farm and establish communities. Ukrainian settlers, for example, made a lasting impact on the cultural landscape of Western Canada. These new immigrants brought with them their own customs, languages, and traditions, contributing to Canada's growing diversity. However, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 brought immigration to an abrupt stop. The war created political and economic instability, making it difficult for people to migrate. Additionally, Canada, like many countries at the time, tightened its borders and placed restrictions on immigration, especially for individuals from enemy nations or regions affected by the war. This pause in immigration had long-lasting effects, as families were separated and migration networks were disrupted. Following the First World War, the Great Depression of the 1930s further impacted immigration. During this period of economic hardship, Canada saw a decline in immigration, and most of the immigrants who did arrive were from Great Britain, Germany, Austria, and Ukraine. Immigrants from these regions were still seen as more desirable due to cultural similarities and their perceived ability to assimilate into Canadian society. During the Depression, only 6% of immigrants were of non-European origin, reflecting the racial and cultural biases that influenced immigration policy at the time. After the Second World War, immigration to Canada picked up again, and the majority of immigrants came from the United Kingdom. Many Britons were looking for a fresh start after the devastation of the war, and Canada's economic growth in the post-war years made it an attractive destination. Canada encouraged this migration, seeking to rebuild its economy with skilled workers and individuals who could contribute to its labor force. This period also saw some early changes in Canadian immigration policy, as the country began slowly opening up to a more diverse range of immigrants, although the preference was still heavily skewed towards those of European descent. As we move forward in our discussion of Canadian immigration, we enter a period of significant transformation, particularly from the 1970s to the turn of the 21st century. This era brought new dynamics to immigration in Canada, reflecting broader social and economic changes both within the country and globally. During this period, immigration numbers fluctuated due to a combination of economic conditions, changing government policies, and global events. Canada experienced periods of both high and low immigration, reflecting shifts in its labor market needs and social priorities. For example, economic recessions during the 1980s led to reduced immigration levels, while periods of economic growth in the late 1990s saw an increase in immigration to meet labor demands, particularly in urban centers. This fluctuation also reflected changes in Canada's immigration policies. During the 1970s, the Canadian government moved towards a points-based immigration system, which prioritized immigrants based on their skills, education, language ability, and potential contribution to the economy. This system allowed for more diverse immigration, as it focused less on nationality or ethnicity and more on individual qualifications. One of the most significant shifts during this time was the dramatic increase in Asian immigrants. Starting in the 1970s and continuing into the 21st century, Canada saw a rise in immigration from countries such as China, India, the Philippines, and Vietnam. This change was driven by several factors, including political instability in certain Asian regions, such as the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and Canada's growing reputation as a destination for economic and educational opportunities. By the 1990s, immigrants from Asia were among the largest groups arriving in Canada, particularly settling in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. This wave of Asian immigration transformed the cultural and demographic landscape of Canada, contributing to the rich multicultural fabric we see today. Asian immigrants brought with them a diversity of languages, religions, and cultural practices that enriched Canadian society. They also played a key role in driving economic growth, particularly through entrepreneurship and participation in key industries such as technology, healthcare, and trade. Now let's focus on the modern era and how immigrants are admitted into Canada based on different categories. In recent decades, the majority of immigrants coming to Canada have been admitted under the economic category. This means that these immigrants are selected based on their potential to contribute to the Canadian economy through their skills, education, work experience, and language proficiency. The points-based immigration system prioritizes individuals who can fill labor market gaps, especially in sectors like healthcare, technology, and engineering. Immigrants admitted under this category include skilled workers, business owners, and entrepreneurs who are expected to integrate quickly into the workforce and contribute to Canada's economic growth. Canada has also introduced specific programs like the Provincial Nominee Program, PNP, and Express Entry, which target immigrants with the skills and qualifications needed by particular provinces or industries. This ensures that the needs of both national and regional labor markets are met. The second largest group of immigrants is admitted under the family class category. This class allows Canadian citizens and permanent residents to sponsor their close family members, such as spouses, children, parents, and grandparents, to come to Canada. The goal of the family class category is to reunite families, which is a core principle of Canadian immigration policy. Family reunification is seen as essential for supporting the well-being of immigrants, helping them settle more easily by building strong family support networks. This category highlights the social aspect of immigration, where integration into Canadian society is bolstered by having family ties within the country. The third largest group consists of refugees, who are admitted on the basis of humanitarian need. Canada has a long-standing tradition of accepting refugees from regions affected by war, persecution, or natural disasters. Under international law, refugees are protected from being returned to situations where their lives are in danger. Over the years, Canada has accepted refugees from a variety of global crises, such as those fleeing conflict in Syria, Afghanistan, and most recently, Ukraine. While refugees are a smaller proportion of overall immigration numbers, their admission reflects Canada's commitment to humanitarianism and its international obligations. Now let's look at how state policies in Canada have historically shaped immigration and family life. Immigration policies are not just about numbers. They have deep social and economic implications, particularly for families. Historically, Canadian immigration policies were designed with two primary goals in mind: to populate the country and to contribute to the labor force. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Canada needed people to settle its vast, undeveloped land and workers to drive the growing economy. The government actively encouraged immigration, particularly from Europe and the United States, to build farms, railroads, and industries. These policies were largely focused on attracting cheap labor, which was critical for developing infrastructure and the economy. However, the type of labor and the terms under which immigrants were admitted often varied depending on Canada's economic needs at the time. A clear example of this focus on cheap labor can be seen with the immigration of thousands of young Chinese men in the late 19th century. These men were recruited to work on the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, a massive project essential to connecting the country's eastern and western provinces. Chinese workers were brought in because they were seen as a cheap and expendable source of labor. They were often assigned the most dangerous and backbreaking jobs, facing harsh conditions and discrimination. The government's immigration policy at the time allowed these men to come to Canada temporarily, with the understanding that they would return to their homeland after completing their work on the railway. This provision was part of a broader strategy to prevent these laborers from permanently settling in Canada and bringing their families over, which was tied to racist fears of a permanent Chinese presence in the country. As a result, many Chinese workers faced isolation, unable to bring their families with them, and often found themselves stuck in Canada without the means to return home. The government later imposed the Chinese head tax and eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act, further restricting Chinese immigration and preventing family reunification. Now, we'll discuss the experiences of refugee families in Canada, a topic that is often misunderstood or misrepresented in the media. Refugees face unique challenges that set them apart from other immigrants, and it's important to understand the legal definition of refugee status and the realities of refugee admission in Canada. A refugee is an individual who has been recognized by a legal body, such as a refugee tribunal, as having a well-grounded fear of persecution or harm. This persecution is often based on specific grounds, such as ethnicity, religion, political opinion, or gender. Refugees are often forced to flee their home countries because their lives are in danger due to conflict, violence, or systemic discrimination. Canada, as a signatory to international refugee agreements like the 1951 Refugee Convention, is obligated to protect individuals who meet this definition. Refugees differ from other immigrants in that they typically do not choose to leave their home countries voluntarily, but are compelled by circumstances beyond their control. For many refugees, Canada represents a safe haven where they can rebuild their lives free from fear. Despite media portrayals that might suggest otherwise, only a relatively small number of people are admitted into Canada as refugees each year, typically around 20,000 to 25,000. While Canada is known for its humanitarian approach and has a strong tradition of accepting refugees, these numbers represent a small fraction of total immigration. It's also important to note that the refugee resettlement process is complex. Not all asylum seekers or displaced persons are granted refugee status. In fact, many applicants undergo lengthy legal and bureaucratic processes to prove that they meet the criteria for refugee status. Additionally, Canada's annual refugee intake is influenced by government policy, international agreements, and global refugee crises, meaning the numbers fluctuate depending on the situation. While refugee families are provided with support to help them integrate into Canadian society, including access to housing, healthcare, and education, they often face unique challenges. These include trauma from their past experiences, cultural adaptation, and the difficulties of starting over in a new country. Refugee families, especially those arriving with children, may require extra support to overcome the hurdles they face in adjusting to their new lives in Canada. As we explore the diversity of families in Canada, it's essential to consider ethnocultural family trends and issues. Family structures and roles can vary significantly across different ethnic groups, but we must approach these topics with care to avoid overgeneralizations and stereotypes. First, it's important to recognize that gender roles and family responsibilities often vary across ethnic groups. In some cultures, gender roles may be more traditionally defined, with distinct expectations for men and women within the family. For example, in some cultures, men may be seen as the primary breadwinners, while women are expected to take on caregiving and domestic responsibilities. In other ethnic groups, family roles may be more fluid, with shared responsibilities between men and women. However, these roles are not fixed. They can evolve over time, especially with exposure to new cultural environments, changes in societal values, or the influence of new generations. In a multicultural country like Canada, these shifts can be seen as families adapt to different social expectations and economic opportunities. While we discuss these trends, it's critical to remember that we should avoid overgeneralizing or falling into stereotypes. There is as much diversity within ethnic groups as there is between them. Not all families from the same ethnic background follow the same patterns of behavior or adhere to the same gender roles. Individual family dynamics can differ based on factors such as socioeconomic status, education, geographic location, and personal values. For example, while some immigrant families may adhere to traditional gender roles, others may embrace more egalitarian structures, especially as they adapt to Canadian norms or as new generations grow up with different experiences. The diversity within ethnic groups is as important to consider as the diversity between them. When examining ethnocultural family trends, we also need to consider factors such as immigration histories and generational status. Families that have recently immigrated to Canada may have different experiences compared to those who have been in the country for multiple generations. For instance, second-generation children, those who are Canadian-born but whose parents were immigrants, may experience a blend of cultural influences from both their parents' country of origin and their upbringing in Canada. These generational differences often lead to changes in family behaviors, with younger generations adapting more quickly to Canadian norms, which can sometimes cause tension or cultural negotiation within families. For example, second-generation children may be more likely to embrace gender equality in the division of household labor or choose careers that differ from traditional family expectations. Moreover, we also need to consider age-related changes in family behaviors. As family members age, their needs and roles within the family may shift. This is particularly true in immigrant families where older adults may depend on their children for financial or social support, while younger family members navigate new cultural identities and expectations in Canada. As we continue our exploration of family dynamics, it's important to focus on immigrant and visible minority families. These families often face unique challenges related to their ethnic and cultural backgrounds, particularly in relation to issues like discrimination, labor market disadvantage, and generational conflict. Statistics Canada defines visible minorities as individuals who are non-Caucasian and non-Indigenous. The main visible minority groups in Canada include Blacks, South Asians, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Southeast Asians, Filipinos, Arabs, West Asians, Latin Americans, and Pacific Islanders. These groups have grown significantly due to immigration, making up a substantial portion of Canada's population. However, these communities face specific challenges related to their status as visible minorities. Being a visible minority in Canada often impacts access to opportunities and affects how individuals and families are treated in various social and institutional contexts. One major issue is that visible minorities are more likely to experience long-term disadvantages in the labor market. This is often due to discrimination, both overt and subtle, that affects their ability to secure stable, well-paying jobs. Even when visible minorities have high levels of education, they may face the devaluation of their educational qualifications, particularly if those qualifications were obtained outside of Canada. This means that highly skilled immigrants may find themselves underemployed or working in jobs that do not reflect their level of expertise. For example, many immigrants who were professionals in their home countries, such as doctors, engineers, or educators, struggle to find equivalent positions in Canada due to barriers in credential recognition and labor market biases. This systemic discrimination can have long-term economic impacts on families, contributing to income inequality and limiting social mobility. Another important challenge for immigrant and visible minority families is generational conflict. These conflicts often arise because older and younger generations experience assimilation at different rates. For the older generation, assimilation can take longer, particularly if they face language barriers or difficulties adjusting to Canadian norms. This generation may hold on to traditional values from their country of origin, which can sometimes clash with the more Canadianized perspectives adopted by younger family members. For instance, parents may struggle to understand their children's adaptation to new social norms, including gender roles, career aspirations, or social behaviors that differ from their cultural expectations. For younger generations, particularly those growing up or attending school in Canada, the challenges can be different. Youth from visible minority families may face difficulties navigating the school system, where they can encounter racial discrimination, cultural isolation, pressures to fit into both their ethnic culture and Canadian culture. These challenges can lead to a sense of identity, conflict, or marginalization, making it harder for young people to thrive in the education system and society. In many immigrant families, the elderly face specific difficulties. For older immigrants who may not have worked long enough in Canada to qualify for a pension, economic vulnerability can be a significant issue. Without pensions or other social safety nets, older family members often rely on their children or extended family for financial support. This can create stress within the family, particularly if the younger generation is already facing challenges in the labor market. Finally, some immigrant families may experience a phenomenon known as astronaut families. In these cases, one family member, usually the father, works overseas while the rest of the family, particularly the wife and children, live in Canada. This arrangement is often made to take advantage of educational opportunities for the children or to secure residency in Canada. However, it can create strain within the family due to prolonged separation, emotional distance, and the challenges of managing life across different countries. The astronaut dynamic can lead to emotional and relational issues as family members deal with long-distance relationships and divided responsibilities. Now let's delve into some of the key sources of generational conflict within immigrant and visible minority families. These conflicts often arise due to differing experiences between older and younger generations in navigating life in Canada. A range of factors, such as dislocation, racism, and changes in gender roles, can contribute to these tensions. First, the process of dislocation and resettlement is challenging for any immigrant family, but it can be especially difficult for those from visible minority backgrounds. Moving to a new country involves adapting to unfamiliar cultural norms, social systems, and environments, which can create stress at both personal and family levels. When you add the experiences of racism and discrimination, these stressors intensify. For the older generation, these challenges often manifest as a struggle to maintain traditional values while adapting to a new way of life. For younger family members, the experience is more about balancing the expectations of their family with the pressures to fit into Canadian society. These differing perspectives can lead to misunderstandings and conflict within the family. Generational conflict can be exacerbated for those who experience multiple sites of oppression, such as racism, poverty, and systemic discrimination. Studies show that individuals who face these overlapping disadvantages are more vulnerable to engaging in criminal activity or becoming involved in risky behaviors. For young people, the sense of exclusion or alienation can push them toward crime or delinquencies, especially if they feel unsupported or discriminated against within school or social settings. These risks highlight the importance of addressing social inequalities and providing visible minority families with adequate support to help prevent generational conflicts from escalating into more serious issues. For the elderly members of immigrant and visible minority families, poverty is a significant concern. Many older immigrants arrive in Canada later in life and may not have had the opportunity to work long enough to qualify for pensions or savings. This financial insecurity often leads to dependency on younger family members for support, which can create economic pressure within the household and strain intergenerational relationships. This situation is common in visible minority groups, where older family members may struggle to access the social safety nets available to those who have spent their working years in Canada. These financial difficulties can contribute to feelings of powerlessness or resentment, further fueling conflict with younger generations who are often dealing with their own economic challenges. Several other factors can contribute to generational conflict within immigrant and visible minority families. Many parents worry their children are losing touch with their cultural heritage as they assimilate into Canadian society. This cultural disconnection can cause tension between parents who may want to preserve traditional customs and children who may prioritize fitting in with their peers. For many immigrants, especially those from visible minority groups, underemployment is a major issue. Parents who were professionals in their home countries often struggle to find work in Canada that reflects their qualifications, leading to frustration and dissatisfaction. This can create tensions within the family, as younger members, particularly those pursuing higher education or starting careers, may have different expectations of success. Immigrant families, especially those from visible minority backgrounds, often face social isolation. Without strong support networks, families may feel disconnected from their communities, making it harder to navigate life in Canada. This isolation can affect both the older and younger generations, leading to conflict over how best to build connections and integrate into Canadian society. The shifting roles of men and women within immigrant families can also cause generational tension. Younger generations may challenge traditional gender expectations that their parents or grandparents hold. For example, younger women may seek more independence or career opportunities, which may not align with the cultural expectations their parents bring from their country of origin. This change can lead to conflict over what roles are acceptable within the family. Another source of generational conflict can be differing views on LGBTQ2 inclusivity. Younger generations, growing up in a more progressive and accepting society, may have more open attitudes toward LGBTQ2 identities, which may clash with the more conservative views of their parents or grandparents. This can create tension within the family, particularly if a family member identifies as LGBTQ2 and struggles to gain acceptance from older generations. To conclude today's discussion, let's take a look at some future trends that will likely shape immigrant and visible minority families in Canada in the coming years. These trends reflect the continuing evolution of Canadian society, the global landscape, and shifting demographic patterns. One of the most notable trends is Canada's increasing diversity. As immigration continues to be a driving force behind population growth, we can expect an even greater multicultural landscape in the future. This means that visible minority and immigrant families will continue to play an essential role in shaping Canadian society. The rise of diversity will bring about changes in social, political, and cultural institutions, pushing for greater inclusivity, tolerance, and the celebration of various cultural traditions. Canada's immigration policies will likely continue to evolve in response to both global and domestic challenges. For example, with labor shortages in certain industries, we might see an increase in immigration under the economic category, prioritizing skilled workers who can fill gaps in technology, healthcare, and other essential sectors. Simultaneously, the government may adjust its policies to address humanitarian needs, particularly as climate change and conflict displace more people globally, resulting in increased numbers of climate refugees or displaced persons. As the population ages, there may be a growing emphasis on intergenerational support networks. Families, especially immigrant families, will likely continue to play a central role in caring for aging parents and grandparents, particularly as social safety nets for elderly care may not fully meet the needs of visible minority communities. These intergenerational bonds could strengthen family ties, but may also require new approaches to caregiving and financial planning to avoid overburdening younger family members. Future trends will likely include a greater focus on promoting social cohesion and integration. As immigrant and visible minority populations grow, policymakers and community leaders will need to address issues such as housing, employment, education, and access to services in a way that fosters inclusion and equity. Ensuring that visible minority families have the resources they need to succeed in Canada will be key to maintaining social harmony and minimizing the effects of systemic discrimination. The continued rise of technology and access to education will also play a significant role in shaping future family dynamics. Digital tools and online education have already transformed how we connect and learn, and this trend is likely to continue. For immigrant families, technology can serve as a critical resource for overcoming language barriers, accessing healthcare, and maintaining transnational family ties. Similarly, advancements in education will empower younger generations to adapt quickly to the Canadian labor market, contributing to economic growth and social integration. As climate change intensifies, we can expect to see more climate-related migration in the coming years. Families displaced by rising sea levels, droughts, or extreme weather events will seek new homes in countries like Canada. These climate refugees will bring additional diversity to Canada's population, but may also face significant challenges related to displacement, resettlement, and rebuilding their lives in a new environment. Finally, we will likely see evolving family structures. As gender roles, sexual orientation, and definitions of family become more fluid, we can expect visible, minority, and immigrant families to reflect these changes. Blended families, same-sex partnerships, and non-traditional family arrangements will become increasingly normalized, creating more diverse family configurations. These shifts will challenge conventional ideas of family, but also open up new possibilities for how families function and support each other.